In this lecture, we're going to start talking about our macronutrients, focusing first on the macronutrient carbohydrate. So here on the right side of your screen, you're going to see three images, and forgive me that I didn't fully crop away the writing of the original pictures, but you'll see on the top right corner, the colorful image is of a complete protein molecule. Kind of in the middle to the left is a complex carbohydrate molecule, and in the bottom right-hand corner, we see a triglyceride or a fat molecule. So as kind of a review from Unit 1, the carbohydrate, the fat, and the protein are our three macronutrients. Some things that these macronutrients have in common with each other, all of them are going to be made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Protein is a little bit different because it also includes the element nitrogen, and we'll get to that more in a couple weeks. Again, as we sort of saw in the beginning of the course, macronutrients are, when compared to micronutrients, larger molecules that are made up of smaller molecules, and we call those smaller molecules monomers or building blocks. So today we're focusing specifically on carbohydrates. We'll see in the next few slides that the large carbohydrate molecule or the complex carbohydrate molecule is really just a giant chain, sometimes with different side chains or branches, completely made up of individual molecules, which we call glucose or simple sugars. And when we talk about the food supply, it's really worth noting that all naturally occurring foods, so all real whole foods, contain some amount of carbohydrate, fat, and protein. I know sort of colloquially we talk about foods as being either a carb or a fat or a protein, but really all foods, again, real whole foods, once we start processing and manufacturing our foods, then we can kind of tinker with what is in the food. But naturally occurring food does contain all three of the macronutrients in varying amounts, varying ratios. So when we classify a food as a carbohydrate food or a protein food or a fat food, what we're actually doing is classifying it based on which macronutrient it has the most of. And we will also see, especially as we move into the fat and protein lectures, that in the human body, we don't see exclusively carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Sometimes we see these molecules bound to each other. So we might see a fat and a protein bound together. We'd call that a lipoprotein. And we're going to talk kind of extensively about that in the fats lectures. We might see molecules that are a sugar molecule bound to a fat or a glycolipid, or a sugar molecule bound to a protein, a glycoprotein. And then again, something that should be familiar to you by now is this overarching theme that carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, our macronutrients, do contain energy in the form of calories. Carbohydrate is the human body's primary source of fuel. So for the most part, we ingest or we eat carbohydrate foods to extract the energy from those foods. Fats are a secondary source of energy for the human body. And protein, although proteins do contain calories, they do contain energy, mostly the human body takes in protein to then utilize it, kind of sequester those amino acids and utilize those amino acids in the structural and functional components of the human body. So enzyme function, hormones, and actual cell structure. And again, this lecture will focus exclusively on carbohydrates, so we'll go a little deeper into fats and proteins in subsequent lectures. We use synonymously with monosaccharide. So again, remembering the main function of the carbohydrate is the primary source of fuel for the body. We'll see in the next slides too that humans can actually store carbohydrates or store glucose molecules in the form of glycogen, and plants can store carbohydrates in the form of starch. Okay, so a little bit more focus here on the monosaccharides. Three monosaccharides that I want you guys to be familiar with in particular are glucose, fructose, and galactose. I'll need to edit the wording down below, but you'll see that vegetables and fruits are where we find glucose. Fructose we find also in fruits as well as honey, and galactose is a simple sugar that we only find in milk. And again, you'll notice if you break apart the word galactose, we have lactose, which I think we all associate with milk. So galactose we only find in milk. So on the previous slide I mentioned glucose, but do understand that all three of these, as well as some 3-carbon and other 5-carbon sugars, collectively are called simple sugars. But for the purpose of this class, we're going to focus on just these 3. From monosaccharide, we can build to disaccharide. And again, as the word would imply, di means 2, and saccharide meaning sugar. So there are 3 common disaccharides that are naturally occurring that I'd like you to be familiar with. And you'll see, as the diagram implies, a disaccharide is 2 basic sugar molecules bound to each other. So sucrose is glucose bound to fructose. Lactose, which is our milk sugar, is galactose bound to glucose. And maltose is 2 molecules of glucose bound to each other. Maltose we actually really only see in the fermentation of grain products. Lactose we only see in milk. And sucrose is your common table sugar, and that's also something that we would see in fruits and some vegetables. So totally naturally occurring. And kind of continuing to build the chain from mono and disaccharide, we would build to an oligosaccharide and then a polysaccharide. Oligo means a few, so usually like 3 glucose molecules in a chain, and poly means many. In this case, when we say many, we're talking about hundreds to thousands of glucose molecules bound to each other. And as you'll notice in the diagram, we have a starch molecule, which is a type of polysaccharide. And you see that it's many, many, many glucose molecules. You can see that this is the hexagonose, the 6-sided sugar, bound to each other. And again, you have the base chain with various sub-branches, branches and sub-branches coming off of it. And again, the zoom-in version shows us that it's glucose bound to glucose bound to glucose, and so on. So let's look a little further at polysaccharides. So we have 3 types of polysaccharides that we find in our food. We have fibers, starches, and glycogen. We said a minute ago that glycogen is the human, or the animal storage form of sugar. So not just humans, but all land and water animals will store glucose in the form of glycogen, and typically we store it in our muscle and our liver. So when we consume meat, typically the glycogen stores are quite small, and so by the time an animal has been killed and then we've eaten the meat, there isn't actually hardly any glycogen or glucose left in the muscle tissue. So we don't really think of animal flesh as being any notable source of carbohydrate. But in the human body, we will access our glycogen stores throughout the day. So sort of continually, any given day, we're going to be accessing glycogen stores in our liver and in our muscle. And then starch, we know, is the storage form of glucose in plants. And again, I'm sure we're all familiar with the word starch and foods that we associate with starch. We think of root vegetables like carrots and beets and potatoes, sweet potatoes. And we think probably of grains too, like rice or oatmeal, or quinoa if you've had it, or breads, anything made from wheat or flour. So all of those, yes, are starchy, and that's because they are derived from plants, and plants do store a lot of glucose. And then this third piece, fiber, so you see the image on the left is showing an example of cellulose. And what I do want you guys to start to notice is the difference in the chemical structure of these molecules. So you'll notice how cellulose is very linear, and I think on the next, we'll look at this in a little more detail. So if you look at kind of the bonds between the glucose molecules and cellulose, you'll see how kind of tightly packed cellulose is. Starch, we have two types of starch, amylose and amylopectin, and you'll notice that especially amylose is kind of in a tight linear chain, and then amylopectin does the branching like we saw in the previous diagram of starch. And glycogen similarly has a lot of branching. So this presents a really major difference. The shape of the polysaccharide makes a really big difference for how the human body can digest it. And so you'll notice actually this second from the bottom row, which is called diagram, you'll notice how these glucose molecules are represented. So they're kind of alternate being flipped. So this one is sort of right side up, this one's upside down, right side up, upside down. Whereas in starch and in glycogen, all of the glucose molecules are in the same orientation. So what this is actually representing is a different type of bond, and this chart calls it subunit. So beta glucose, or there's technically a beta bond and there's an alpha bond, which indicates whether or not the two glucose molecules are bound to each other in the same orientation or in opposing orientation. And as it were, the human body can't actually digest the bonds when they can't digest the beta bond. So when we see the glucose molecules bound to each other in opposite orientation, we as humans don't have the enzymatic capacity to digest them. So that's why fiber, I think we're all familiar with, fiber is something that the human body does not digest. However, because starch and glycogen use alpha bonds, that means that we can actually digest these. And interestingly, amylose digests a little bit more slowly than amylopectin. And it's a bit intuitive, fairly intuitive, because amylose is just a singular chain of glucose molecules. So we can really only cleave one glucose at a time. Whereas amylopectin, with all the branching, we could have multiple enzymes working on all these various endpoints at any given moment, and therefore we can digest amylopectin much more rapidly than we can amylose. And you'll see the percentages at the top. So amylose and amylopectin are both naturally occurring in our food supply. Starchy foods contain roughly 80 to 85% amylopectin and significantly less amylose, so only 15 to 20% amylose. And you'll notice too, again, that the glycogen does have the alpha bonds and the branching, which again sort of makes sense. We're continually throughout the day pulling glucose from glycogen and then recreating glycogen in the muscle and the liver. So it makes sense that glycogen would be all branched like this because we can more readily and easily access it. Okay, so kind of as we transition from talking about our polysaccharides, we're going to start talking more specifically about fiber for a couple of slides. And so before we do that, I want to introduce the microbiome. And I hope that this term is not unfamiliar to you. It's definitely receiving a lot of attention in the popular media lately. So the microbiome refers to all of the bacteria that live inside and on our human bodies. What we've been learning about the microbiome over the past really 20 to 30 years is that these bacteria actually have kind of evolved with us. So we and the bacteria have a pretty symbiotic, meaning mutually beneficial relationship with each other. So when the bacteria inside and on our bodies are healthy, we are healthier too. And it also goes that when we find that when we are sick or dealing with a disease or dealing with an illness, whether chronic or temporary, we find that the gut bacteria are also not in the best health. And I did just mention the gut bacteria. So while I said that the microbiome refers to the bacteria on all of our body surface, inside and out, for the purpose of this class, we'll focus specifically on the gut microbiome, and also to a lesser extent, the bacteria that line the entire alimentary canal. Alimentary meaning the path that food travels when we ingest, digest, and then eliminate. So that's everything from the mouth, down the esophagus, through the stomach and intestines, and out the colon. And we will look at that in more detail in a few weeks also. So I just want to introduce this concept of the symbiotic relationship between the gut bacteria and human health, because when we talk about soluble and insoluble fibers, we'll find that soluble fiber can actually be digested by gut bacteria. Fiber, as I said previously, due to the shape, the structure, and the bonds between the glucose molecules in fiber, fiber is not something that the human body can digest. However, soluble fibers can be digested by gut bacteria. So a few key differences between soluble and insoluble fiber. First of all, soluble fiber, as the word kind of implies, so it doesn't dissolve in water, but it's soluble, which means it can pull water in. So if you think about a couple of weeks ago, if any of you did the lab experiments with chia seeds or oatmeal, you notice that those foods pull water into them and they become a little bit viscous and kind of almost gelatinous-like, not quite gelatinous, but a little bit gel-like. And so that the molecule inside of those foods causing that gel-like reaction are the soluble fibers pulling the water in, or maybe you used a nut milk or a milk, but either way, the soluble fibers absorb that liquid, turning into a like gel-like substance. So soluble fibers absorb water, and that's really beneficial to the human body because it helps to bulk up our stool, kind of preparing stool for a bowel movement. And again, gut bacteria can digest these fibers, and in doing so, they release various molecules that we then use in various systems throughout the body. So we use the byproducts of bacterial digestion in our gut for our immune system. We use it for our nervous system. We use it to sort of help with repair to the lining of the gastrointestinal wall if damage has occurred. So lots of really beneficial things coming about from the gut bacteria as they digest soluble fibers. Pectins, gums, and mucilages are types of soluble fibers, and we'll find these in foods like fruits, grains. Oats are a very commonly talked about source of soluble fiber, and beans. So any type of kidney bean or red bean or black bean, etc., are going to be great sources of soluble fiber. So on the other hand, we have insoluble fibers. These don't absorb water, but what they do, what purpose they do serve is also very significant and twofold. So insoluble fibers, when we ingest them, they do have somewhat of a laxative effect on our digestive tract, on our large intestine in particular. So they help to sort of stimulate a bowel movement. Ingestion of insoluble fibers also helps us feel full and satisfied when we're eating. So really, really important things there. And as you'll see as you move through Project 1, you'll see that I ask you to be recording your bowel movements in your food diary. Because nutrition, really, if we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about everything from how food is grown to time that we ingest it into our mouths, what happens in our digestive tract, and then we eliminate any waste product or aspects of food that we don't use, like insoluble fibers. So talking about nutrition sort of necessarily includes conversation about the state of affairs of gastrointestinal health, which includes conversation on bowel movement frequency. So really a healthy digestive tract would see a bowel movement 1, 2, or 3 times a day. So insoluble fibers we find in whole grains and vegetables, and to a lesser whole grains and vegetables, yeah. Okay, and then last bit, we did talk on this already a bunch, but just to kind of wrap it up. So the functions of the carbohydrate to the human body. We know for sure that the carbohydrate is the primary source of fuel. We've seen how carbohydrates aid in digestion for the human body. So fibers in particular, on one hand, the soluble fibers help to keep healthy gut bacteria alive and flourishing, which in turn helps our overall digestive processes. And then we see soluble and insoluble fibers acting together to help form our stool and then help us pass our stool and have consistent regular bowel movements. And then these last two terms, protein sparing and kind of protecting us from ketoacidosis. So in the event that we are underfed or not taking in enough calories, and especially in the case where the body does not have a lot of fat reserves or fat tissue, the body will turn to the protein that again makes up our bodies. So all cell tissue is made up of proteins. As I'd mentioned briefly, hormones and enzymes are made of proteins. So when we don't take in enough carbohydrate through our food supply, the body will start breaking down human tissue and human cells to harness the protein and then metabolize that to release energy. So important that we do take in enough carbohydrate so that we don't start seeing protein breakdown. Also, what we'll talk about in a little more depth when we go to the protein lecture is that, remember I said at the beginning of this lecture, all macronutrients contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but protein also contains nitrogen. And nitrogen we don't have a very great use for in the body unless it's found in the amino acid. So if we take in protein in excess of what we need, we have to process all that extra nitrogen out, and we have to do that through the liver and the kidneys. And so excessive protein intake will actually overly tax the kidney and the liver and can lead to long-term damage in those two organs. But that is not exactly what protein sparing is. Protein sparing is just saving the body from breaking down proteins. So that was a little bit of a digression. And then ketoacidosis. Some of you, if you're familiar with diabetes at all, you might be familiar with this term. So similar to when the body doesn't see enough carbohydrate coming in, like we have to use something for fuel. So we may at certain times go to our body tissue and break those down to harness protein for an energy source. If we do have fat reserves on the body, we will, again, at certain times go to the fat reserves and break those down for energy. What happens when we break fat down for energy is we end up with molecules called ketones or ketone bodies. That's just a byproduct of fat digestion, fat metabolism, excuse me. And so if we have large amounts of ketone bodies or ketones floating around in our blood supply, these are very acidic molecules. Well, not very, but they are acidic molecules. So if we have a lot of them in the blood supply, we will actually see the pH of the blood decreased. And especially for those of you who are nurses or otherwise work in the health field, you know that the human body blood pH is right around 7.2, 7.3. And that's pretty critical that the blood pH stay right around there. And as soon as we see the pH move higher, much higher than that or much lower than that, we start to see malfunction in many aspects of how our bodies are operating. So ketoacidosis is that issue of the blood becoming too acidic because of an overabundance of ketone bodies in the blood, which resulted from the breakdown of fat tissue to harness energy because there was not enough carbohydrate available. Or in the case of type 2 diabetes, because there's some problem with how the body is responding to insulin, and so we can't actually get the glucose into the cells. So we might take in enough carbohydrate, but we're not adequately using it or metabolizing it. And thus the body turns to the fat tissue or the, and thus makes ketone bodies.